You know that Chief Banks took a chunk out of me for that trip we took to the Wingate Institute this afternoon? Doesn't want me taking out some personal vendetta on the taxpayer's nickel. Can you believe that? A friggin' senator's kid gets sliced into quarter-inch cubes, and we can't be bothered? What's a psycho gotta do to get our attention, anyways?
Like our friends in the legal profession, I pride myself on finding loopholes, sir. So I was wondering if you were free after work for the next 2 weeks or so, if you'd like to join me in my new hobby, podcasts.
Welcome to Spawnography, everybody. Episode 2 or 3.
We'll see. We'll
We'll
find
see.
out.
Yeah, we'll find out. Anyway, so this is our second arc. Let's talk about that. First off, before we get into that, I'm getting ahead of myself here. My name's George Marston. This is my
Pierce Lemon.
co-host, and I think I stepped on your name.
It's fine. They'll learn it.
Yeah. So, my name's George Marston. My pronouns are they, them, or she, her. You can find my general writing outside of Spawnography at newsarama.com.
And my name's Pierce. My pronouns are they, them. And you can find my writing whenever I do it at Popverse or at newsarama.com or on Twitter or whatever. Anyway.
So this is Spawnography. We're getting into our second arc. After a deep dive into the history of Todd McFarlane and the first arc of Spawn, we're going to be talking about one of the series' first really big breakout issues, as I recall, one of the ones that really got people talking, which is the story of Billy Kincaid in Spawn number 5. And we're also going to be jumping ahead just slightly to discuss the follow-up in Spawn number 8, because those two issues are kind of a pair. 6 and 7 are a totally separate story.
Right. 6 and 7 have to deal with a new character named Overt Kill and have nothing to do with 5 or 8 in so much as they are like plot wise. So we're going to skip ahead a little bit to get a follow up on the Billy Kincaid story in 5 in number 8. It'll seem less weird once we explain it. For anybody that didn't listen, but I don't know why you'd listen to this episode first, what happened in Spawn number 1 through 4, George?
Well, Spawn number 1 through 4 introduced the character of Spawn and his backstory as Al Simmons, a human assassin, a world famous government assassin whose death made waves in the political community. And it deals with Al's return to Earth as Spawn, as a minion of the Malbolgia, his quest to find his wife, and his quest to understand who he is and what his purpose is as the Spawn. And it also shows his first big encounter with the Violator, who is kind of seen as Spawn's original nemesis or archenemy.
Yeah, and we really wrap that arc up with sort of the direction for the series moving forward. We meet Malbolgia, we have Spawn and Violator fight, we have Al, reconnect with his ex-wife, who he hasn't seen since he died. He meets her new husband, who is his former best friend, as well as her new daughter. But Malbolgia spells it out in the last issue. Here's the deal: your job is, with the powers I've given you, to essentially kill bad guys because I need to build up my army. And the more bad guys that you send to hell, the stronger my army gets, and I'm going to fight heaven. I'm going to fight God.
So Spawn has this moral dilemma, is kind of set up as his core arc as Spawn, as the Hell Spawn, is that he wants to do good by killing and stopping bad people, but in doing so, he is strengthening the army of the Malbolgia, who is basically the Satan figure of the story.
Correct. And through all this, we are introduced to a power meter. So we are told that his powers do, as a result of the deal that he made to come to see his wife again. Essentially, he was sort of tricked by Malbolgia. The powers that he's been given are not unlimited. They will run out. And so the issues have introduced a sort of power meter that has been ticking down. It's not really explained to us how much power any one power that he uses. That was a crazy sentence.
There doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason to how much is deducted from the bar depending on what he does.
Right.
But it's implied that the more power he uses at once or in a certain act, the more power comes off the timer. And we're shown this initially when he tries to take his human form, regain his human form because he exists in a kind of burned up zombie body wrapped up in a spawn suit. He tries to take his human form, and it turns out that he, Al Simmons, a black man, can only become human in the body of a kind of indiscriminate anonymous white man, which is another part of his living hell.
Yeah, he kind of looks like Todd McFarlane drawing Warren Worthington.
Yeah. Um,
Like,
so we're getting a little in the weeds on this stuff, but the story ends with Spawn realizing that he has to make this choice on his quest, whether he's going to let the Malbolgia determine what he does, or if he's going to continue being the person he was and acting with the instinct to help people and stop evil that supposedly guided him in life.
yep. And that brings us to Spawn number 5, Justice. That's Stories, Pencils, and Inks by Todd McFarlane. Letters and editor, Tom Orzechowski. Story consultant, Terry Fitzgerald. Colors by Steve Oliff, Ruben Rude, and Oli Optics. And this one's dedicated to Will Eisner. And so this is a one shot that we get after that initial arc. What's funny?
The dedication to Will Eisner
I mean,
on this of all issues is just so randomly weird. Maybe it was the month or year that Eisner passed is probably what it might be.
I don't remember when he passed, but also all the issues have had these dedications that again don't really seem to always line up with
Oh
necessarily.
no, he died in 2005, so he was alive to see
He
this
was alive.
dedication.
Will Eisner knows that the Billy Kincaid issue was dedicated to him, but the dedications don't really seem to have much rhyme nor reason to the contents of the issue. We've seen dedications to Jack Kirby, and et cetera, et cetera.
It's just creators that Todd admires or sees as foundational to what he's doing in his place in the industry.
Right, exactly. And it's really his place in the industry more than his art or anything like that, because these are kind of, as he identified it in the letters column of issue 1, people that he sees as like these great artists who were sort of beaten down by the powers that be, and this sort of authority streak that Todd has is crucial to these early issues of Spawn and kind of crucial to Todd as a person. And we got into that a lot kind of in the last episode. What were your initial thoughts on Spawn number 5? When I read it the first time, when I read it a couple years ago for the first time, I was like, oh, this is the Spawn that I know. Like this is the tone that I was like more aware of, as the public perception of Spawn was like, oh, it's super edgy and like pretty dark.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. For me, this is definitely like the formative issue of Spawn in my mind that I think of as like the first thing that really made me go, "Holy shit!" Because I was, probably a little young to be reading this comic when it came out, but it's the one that I really remember. And so, before we get too deep into digging into it page by page, let's give a quick recap of what happens in this one. It's pretty simple. Basically, in this story, a child predator and murderer named Billy Kincaid is being released from a state psychiatric ward where he's been held on a technicality after he was caught murdering a senator's daughter. He is being released, and Spawn is upset because in life, when Spawn was a very altruistic, world famous government assassin, he was given an assignment to kill Kincaid because of what happened to the senator's daughter. However, because of a technicality in that was exploited, Kincaid is able to go to a mental institution instead of prison, and from there he's able to gain release in just a handful of years, just about 6 years, I think it says. And so Spawn decides to finally fulfill his mission to get revenge on Billy Kincaid, and it's carried out in a particularly brutal fashion, in a way that I think is very haunting and which shows you there's an image at the end of the book that we'll get into that I think really serves to show you the very specific difference between Spawn and other contemporary superheroes, especially ones that Todd McFarlane himself is associated with as a creator.
And I think before we get too much deeper, we, kind of like a light trigger warning on this issue, on this episode. Billy Kincaid is a pretty gruesome dude, so there's going to be some discussion of violence against children, some sexual violence, as we'll also be talking about the follow-up issue by Alan Moore as well. So that's not stuff that you want to hear about. You can turn off this episode and check in with us next episode for a much more conventional superhero story.
So this issue kicks off with our first look at Billy Kincaid's face, and he's deep in the shadows. We can only see, his jowls and his soul patch, basically. He's got this ghastly yellow pallor, almost like that yellow bastard in Sin City. I wonder if there's some influence there in that. Anyway, because Frank Miller will become a part of the Spawn universe very quickly after this issue. So there's a lot of exposition on this first page. This is some of Todd's most writing. There's a lot of
It's
exposition that explains basically what we just said. The staff believes that he is getting under technicality, but they know that he's going to be a model citizen and a changed person, and that he's totally reformed, and that he won't reoffend because he is. They've always been impressed with his model behavior, and they say that he's always a gentleman.
it's kind of a thing that we've seen Todd do before, right? We saw it in issue 2 where he did it with the Violator, right? Where it's big, it's kind of like one page, lots of words. Let's kind of spit a bunch of information at you. I'd say there's more information kind of here to allow you to sort of speed through it. I will say also, bit of an easier page to draw, so probably helps you hit those deadlines. Even though
Right.
Orzakowski is the one that has to figure out how all this works. That said, it's really haunting, like his visage. When we get to the next page, even like he's so dark, like he's still in
He's always
shadow,
cloaked in
except
shadow. Yeah.
yeah, and it's really effective. And obviously, I think it's funny that the random police officers or security guards are completely faceless, but then we get the very obvious Sam and Twitch kind of in the background, kind of overseeing this. Because I think the thing that's really effective about this issue is it's not just Spawn that wants revenge. It is also Sam and Twitch. Like they, in a world where there's really like where like the myth of the good cop is very much a thing. I mean, our real world. Um, like they are actually kind of good cops. Like,
They're definitely shown throughout, and this will become more prominent later on down the road as kind of the counterpoint to Spawn's version of justice, and kind of as an idealized version of what police should be. They're sort of the Commissioner Gordons collectively of this series, where they're sort of above reproach in a lot of ways, and they are very upset that Billy Kincaid is getting out of prison because it was their case, and they wanted him put away, as did everybody else. And Billy Kincaid, he is silent through this whole hearing. He is shown kind of just in darkness as the doctors tell him, not to see the dead girl's parents again and ask for his full cooperation. They say, "Do you understand?" And he just doesn't respond. And they just no sell it. They just say, "Okay, okay, okay. Well, whatever. You're getting out. We want you to get out." For some reason, they're all like totally on board with this facade of justice that he has supposedly reformed, and he is actually recovered and has been through this treatment, which even the doctor kind of acknowledges is just merely a convincing act.
do
But
we think? Do we think that this like I understand the way that this is set up is again like making up for that 5 years that Al wasn't around. So like, hey, a bunch of stuff happened. Is it more effective to just it be the first time he's getting caught? This feels like kind of twisting yourself into knots to figure out why he got out after 6 years, right?
right, I think it's partially Tom Todd McFarlane wanting to explore all these different ideas of failings of justice,
Hmm.
and you can see like places where the system has failed to deal with Billy Kincaid. And I think some of that is to justify why Spawn would feel comfortable extrajudicially murdering someone in the first place. And some of it is to show why Spawn is maybe necessary. You get the impression that it's sort of like the Joker getting out of Arkham
Yeah.
and Batman being like, he got out again. I got to deal with it and put him right back in. And I think in some ways it's to show that in this world, when the villain gets out, Spawn doesn't just go, gotta bring him back to jail.
Right.
But
It's
I
sort of
think,
the it's sort of the forever problem that people have with Batman sometimes. Just like, why does he keep beating up people who have problems and just throwing them in somewhere that is clearly not secure, and they just keep getting out and hurting people? And
right.
like
And
Spawn kind of like puts a exclamation point on their existence, I guess.
right, exactly. And so I think in some ways it shows that. I do think in other ways it's also just kind of complex storytelling, and the kind of complex storytelling that comes from not having a ton of experience as a writer,
Mm,
where you think to yourself, okay, I want this to happen, therefore I have to justify this, therefore, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you never stop to think, well, what if I just cut out the step that's making me have to complicate all these further steps? What if
yeah,
I just go straight to the end of that? Like you said, maybe he was never arrested, never convicted,
right.
and he's still out there. I think part of it is also to show that he's not been murdering children the entire time Spawn's been away, because there's the impact and the following scenes of him beginning kind of hunting children again. We'll get to that in a second. But I think it's Todd wanting to explore certain themes, wanting to show certain ideas about Spawn and how he's different. Again, very this issue is almost a mission statement about how different Spawn is from other contemporary superheroes and from the characters that he's sort of being marketed against, like Spider-Man and Batman specifically. But
I think we really get to see that in the art as Kincaid's been silent the entire time, but now we start to get his sort of inner monologue as he's preparing to be released, where he's thinking about what he's done, and we see these kind of blood splattered panel borders and Kincaid's eyes at the top of the page. It's really haunting and really effective,
it
and
is
it kind of reminds you that like, oh right, Todd McFarlane did the horror Spider-Man book,
right.
you know, like
It's a very it's a very David Fincher-esque kind of page where there's
hmm
this whole mood and the colors. And I like that it starts off. Billy Kincaid has this whole sort of inner monologue about how he can't wait to kill again. It starts off with time. Tomorrow it becomes my friend. And I kind of like that line. It's a little bit simplistic, but it's one of Todd's more poetic little gestures in his prose. And I think that he's really good at starting off monologues like that with some sort of little gesture and then just kind of keeping it simple as he goes along. But this one's pretty haunting. It's just Billy Kincaid describing how he loved murdering kids, can't wait to get back to it, and it shows that he was an ice cream man who lured children into his ice cream truck, did his terrible, terrible crimes, and then stuffed them in the ice cream freezer. And it
yeah,
ends with this full shot of Kincaid's face. The first time we see basically, I guess, the same, more of his face, and he's smiling. It's the first time we see him grin, and he's saying, "Those were such fun times. I'll never forget. Not ever." And as he's being let out of prison on the next page, they're saying, "Oh, it's good to see you smiling, Billy. You know, I'm glad to see you're happy about your impending freedom." But as he's being let out by the cops, he's kind of muttering to himself, "You scream, I scream. We all scream for ice cream," which kind of becomes not only his mantra, which is that classic kind of kids rhyme, but it sort of gets twisted at the end into the punchline of the issue. And again, we'll get to that. I keep referring to the end of the issue, and we'll get to that. But
yeah. I mean, I love again, I love having Sam and Twitch here because Sam really points out he's they get to work as the audience surrogate very much so in that like why is this happening? Like why is this guy getting out? And he's pretty quick to call it out and be angry about it.
and he even
Um,
hears Billy say the rhyme. He says, "What the hell was that?" And he
yeah,
says, "I don't find anything." The doctor says it was just a cute rhyme. He says, "I don't find this cute at all." But the doctor says the psychiatrists have all agreed. And Sam kind of rants, "Screw your psychiatrist. He's gonna kill again. 20 kids disappeared from his town. He's not cured." And then it starts. The next page is kind of continuing that, with Spawn, or no, that's not even Spawn's inner monologue, with just the kind of narrative captions explaining how much Sam Burke loves the law.
I do like when we get sort of just Todd narration sometimes, like the Billy Kincaid monologue starting off with time. Like I like that this omniscient narrator is like the law. Like it's a little over dramatic, but it does work really well as he sort of explains like what's up with Sam, like what's going through Sam's head exactly, but explaining how he's feeling. And it's a little bit of like how like it's we understand it because like how we're feeling as well.
And
Because
this
Billy
is
Kincaid, it seems terrible. So
Yeah, and this is also our introduction to a little bit, just a bit of Twitch's backstory that he's been on the force for 16 years, and he's been dealing with the worst of the worst kind of criminals the whole time. This is some of the best little, again, more kind of nice little prose here, where he says he's shared hundreds of evenings with these criminals. But then he says some nights gave positive results, others went deadly. He lost a partner to one of those. We learn that Twitch is not his first partner. And that's
right.
something that will also come to kind of define their relationship down the road as they trust each other more and gain more confidence in each other. But we get another page of talking heads. They're kind of
Oh
all just giving their opinion on Kincaid. It's another of that sort of Frank Miller-ish Dark Knight Returns esque gimmick that was used several times in the first arc. I think just about one page an issue. Todd can't help
yeah.
himself from having the talking heads kind of giving a sort of bird's eye view of what not just Spawn and Sam, but people in the world and the perception of the people in the world are feeling about Billy Kincaid being released.
Do we think that that's really effective? I mean, I think especially if you look at comics at the time, I would say if we're thinking like 92, 93, right? I'm thinking of X-Men specifically, and outside of Operation Zero Tolerance, we don't really get a larger like 90s X-Men in general. Like we don't get a larger sense of like how people feel about mutants, except we know that they live in a world that hates and fears them. But like I would say that the writers of the time don't get incredibly invested in what the world at large is thinking about with mutants. I think that Marvel has an interesting thing about trying to be like the world outside your window. Claremont X-Men is so interested in like your Candy Southerns and your like other ancillary human characters who exist to be that point of view of the world at large.
Yeah,
But
in some ways, it's kind of like the Spider-Man comics of the '70s and the late '60s, where I want to give a little credit to Stan Lee, but primarily Steve Ditko and John Romita and other Jim Mooney and other artists that were working on the title and doing most of the actual plotting. Were digging into some of that stuff about not just what people saw about Spider-Man through the Daily Bugle, but there was a lot of Greek chorus from college students and stuff like that in those issues. And this kind of that kind of gimmick is carried over here. Something I just noticed is that they're on different channels now as opposed to when they
yeah,
first started. So, okay, our first reporter here is on CNN. The second guy used to be on My View on too, and now he's on 99 guest comment. I don't know what that is. But also, our first canonically gay character, the queer reporter, now has a very thin John Waters style mustache, and he's
yep.
straight up on E Entertainment Television now.
Well, he's queer up on E.
Yeah, thank you. But the basic three rundowns we get are just a sort of a very newsy kind of brief on everything we've already learned about Billy Kincaid, but tied up into one sort of knot that he was convicted of this one child killing, got on a technicality, served only eight. He murdered the 8-year-old daughter of a senator. Second one is more about the senator and a love affair that he had, and the third one is really a very reactionary kind of sort of law and order kill them all and let God sort them out response from the sort of right wing reactionary commenter guy. And honestly,
With a fun Shadowhawk reference
oh
too. A
yes, it
little
does.
Jim Valentino.
He says, I hope someone breaks his back. Are you listening, Shadowhawk? Or Mr. Shadowhawk, he says. And that's interesting. I mean, I think in some ways, because one, we're not given like the left wing, like maybe he's really rehabilitated. Well, I guess I shouldn't equate that, but to like a liberal, a bleeding heart liberal kind of response to that, which you would normally see as the counterpoint to the reactionary response. The take by the reactionary guy is kind of also the take that the issue has overall. Like that sort of really reflects the view of Spawn and of this comic. Maybe not Sam, who is wants to approach it from a very straightforward law and order, like justice can be served in the system kind of approach. But it's interesting that that becomes the he says can some violent superhero please take care of this guy? And guess what? His prayers are about to be answered because one absolutely will.
Not to backtrack too much, we also in the sort of monologue about or the narration about the law with Sam, we do get a shot of Spawn, and it's supposed to juxtapose that it's foreshadowing. I don't think it's great foreshadowing because it doesn't necessarily make a ton of sense unless this was like the first issue.
Mm.
We kind of know that these characters exist on these like opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of how they interpret justice, and I think it's a little clunky. We also get the power meter again, and seemingly Spawn has not done anything except been asleep.
Yeah.
So
Maybe, maybe it takes him. Maybe it costs him his power bar to sleep.
I guess so. That
Relatable.
power bar, the power meter is inexplicable for so much of the early, and I think in my first time reading through it, I was fascinated by it, but I was like, I don't know what this is, and I don't know the rules of it, and I don't want to rules lawyer like Spawn and Hell, I guess. But like I'm just like, what does it mean? Like tell me what it means. We move on from the talking heads though to Queens. We're gonna go see Wanda, Spawn and Todd's favorite person.
Yes.
And we're going to see Cyan as well. And we're going to, obviously we've already established that Billy Kincaid is a child killer. And so who who has Spawn already met
That has
that
a child.
that has a kid and would be threatened by this? It's kind of a funny little page.
And it kind of has
Um,
this punchline at the end almost, where she's saying to Cyan in her crib, "Dream well, my sweetheart." But that caption is over a page of Spawn just straight up sleeping in trash. And there is a,
and in the same like pose essentially as Cyan two panels before.
but
It's kind of
instead of
nice.
a stuffed Felix the cat or a stuffed Cerberus,
Yeah.
foreshadowing the next few issues here because there's a Cerberus on the page, and then also Spawn is sleeping next to a bottle of Moore Miller beer.
Yeah.
So hint
Which
hint.
is pretty fun.
Yeah, it's nice, and it's another one of those little things where Todd kind of loves comics. He's kind of a comics jock, and as much as he's a jock for sports, he's also a jock for comics in a real like rah rah go team kind of way. Uh,
Totally.
Base Todd tried to unionize the comics industry for a long time, but that juxtaposition of Spawn and Cyan will kind of continue with a juxtaposition of Billy Kincaid and some kids and Cyan and Wanda. But before that, we get a page of Sam and Twitch establishing that they're going to go on a stakeout. Sam gives this monologue about how much he's pissed off. Twitch agrees, and they both also agree that they have to do anything they do by the book because the law must be upheld. So they decide to go on a stakeout. 2 days later, we don't see their stakeout. 2 days later, the next page is Billy Kincaid driving around saying, "You scream, I scream, we both screamed for ice cream." Little girl comes to his popsicle truck, and
Little girl who might be like 40-year-old Cindy Lauper.
yeah, Todd's second rendering of a child's face on this panel is it has some adult features. It's yeah, I get what he's going for with it, but she does look at least like more like a teenager or an adult. Billy Kincaid is telling her how pretty she is. She's want a free popsicle. Come on into my truck and get the flavor you want. And then we get a very very creepy panel rather,
Yeah.
where Billy Kincaid is in this house, this creepy old like remote cabin, and he's counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and he says, "I just love doing finger painting. It's so fun." And it is lettered like so. And then we see that he is gluing children's fingers to a piece of paper tacked up to the wall.
The little detail that I think I didn't mention or I didn't realize the first time that I read the issue is that because my initial thought was like, how did Billy Kincaid get an ice cream truck again? Oh, he just killed the former ice cream person.
Yeah,
Like that's like it's kind of in the background and it's not super clear, or he at least like knocked them out, but it looks like they're bleeding from their head, right?
yeah,
In the panel where he's like, "Oh, although she won't notice today, little Shirley Johnson will be getting served by a new vendor." There's like a a body in the background, and I
yeah,
guess like he kills the old ice cream truck
yeah.
driver
Yes.
and
It would
steals the
be
truck.
it's because of the feature, the coloring of the hair and everything, it's almost easy to mistake that as the little girl's body and
Yeah,
almost in a storytelling gaffe, but it's not. You're right. That's the previous driver of the ice cream truck that's stuffed back there.
and I do like that we were kind of saying before, like, well, why don't you just sort of skip some of the explanation for stuff so you don't tie yourself up into knots about kind of getting to the next thing and overcomplicating your story? But that's a very subtle panel that just kind of gets you moving through.
It tells
You
you what
could,
you need to know. It might work
yeah,
a little better if like the person was colored a little differently so that it wasn't
yeah,
so easy to mistake for like just a weird out of sequence. But she's wearing different clothes or they're wearing different clothes. It's kind of hard to say. And but yeah, it's just one panel can tell us so much more than so many bubbles of dialogue repeating the same thing about Billy Kincaid got out too
very
early.
true.
He's a creep and everyone knows it, but he got out too early, but he's a creep, but everyone knows it, but he got out too early. So the next page, boy, kicks off
Yeah,
with a bang. I don't this is some weird nothing else is said about this panel except for this one panel. And I guess it's just to sell the idea that Billy Kincaid is crazy. And we see that while he is doing this, he is dressed in drag, and it looks like he's wearing the little girl's hair and her
yeah,
like her scalp on his head, along with like an old lady's dress and pearls, and it's I kind of hate it. I have to say.
yeah.
I know that it's a common shorthand, especially in the '90s, with Buffalo
Silence of the Lambs
Bill and
is
Silence
yeah
of the
the big one,
Lambs, and yeah, which that's a whole another discussion of its own. But the trans panic idea, or the idea that people who are transvestites or who would wear women's clothes, crazy people do that. Child murderers do that. It's
right?
making that association like he's so crazy that not only is he literally gluing a child's fingers to a board, the
Right, which would have
escalation
been enough.
the escalation of that is that he's doing it in a dress. Now, I get that the bigger point is that he's wearing the girl's hair on his head,
Right.
but nonetheless, I can't let that pass without being deeply critical of the
I do think it is a bit of, and I don't want to give anybody involved a pass on this. I do understand that it's just a little bit of shorthand of the time, and it is the 90s. I think are really interesting in terms of queerness in mainstream culture, because it did feel like there was a little bit of time. Obviously, we have, the AIDS epidemic. We're kind of like not necessarily like coming out of it. Obviously, it's still a problem, but like more of a problem in the 80s, and it seems to be kind of turning the corner in the 90s.
and
We get also an X-Men, right? We get the legacy virus. Like we're like comics creators I do think are trying to like tackle issues sometimes. Now, I don't think that's what Todd is doing here. I do think it
no.
is shock value and it is supposed to reinforce negative stereotypes in the sense that like again, all trans people are crazy. All queer people, there's something wrong with them. And I think that that's unfortunate. But I think similar to our discussion about like Todd's kind of politics
Yeah.
within this is that like he's generally so apolitical that I don't think he means to do it. I think it's just poor storytelling. Like he didn't find a better thing to do.
Well, for example, to touch on that, I don't think he meant to be like, I'm going to have this reactionary guy lay out exactly the opinion of what's going to happen in this comic. I think he just thought, like, that's what that kind of guy would be saying on the radio. And then also, of course, Spawn, world famous government assassin, would finish the job that he left undone when he was
Right.
killed. But you're right about also, I just want to go back and touch on, I just want to get this thought out that there was this strange dichotomy in the 90s in the portrayal of queerness
Yeah.
where visible queerness in the 90s, especially, and visible gayness for gay men was very often portrayed as extremely effeminate and feminizing, often portrayed through the idea of men in women's clothing being a statement of gayness more than anything else. And that is kind of contrasted by the influx of trans panic media. And there are things like Silence of the Lambs, like The Crying Game.
Yeah.
And I don't necessarily want to put those films on the same page in terms of their portrayal of, sexual and gender identity. But
You got Ace Ventura a year after
Ace
this too.
Ventura, perfect example, where if you are a man in a dress, that's fine. But if you are a woman in a dress who other people might perceive as a man because you are assigned male at birth, if you are a trans person, the language that we didn't quite have nailed down yet, then
Right.
that is a step too far. That's crazy. And you can see this sort of masculine portrayal of femininity as a response to that panic. And I
I
think it
mean, look
does
at
speak to Todd McFarlane as a purveyor of media and not a purveyor of politics that he dives so deep into the horror media version of this right away.
yeah, 100%. And I like what you're saying about that sort of the masculine idea of femininity that is sort of presented in the 90s. I think Tu Wong Fu
Perfect
is the
example.
perfect example of that, right? Who do you get in a dress? Patrick
Patrick
Swayze and
Swayze
Wesley Snipes,
and
right?
John
And John
Leguizamo.
Leguizamo. And John
John
Leguizamo
Leguizamo, Spawn
coming
alum.
coming up
Spawn
again.
Zone, John Leguizamo, and honestly, that is a movie that really spoke to a lot of queer people and awakened queerness in a lot of people, and
Yeah.
still is received that way. And it's a movie that, while there of course were jokes about those guys in dresses, in the media or whatever, it was perceived as a celebration of queerness, and as like
Hmm.
Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, is another one that is very
It's a
much
great movie.
about, again, but it's that drag is good,
Right.
trans is bad. Drag is good because ultimately you're satirizing your masculinity. You are not embracing femininity in the view of some of this 90s media culture. I'm not saying that's what drag is. There's something striking, and I don't think Todd McFarlane sat down and thought, I'm going to do something really fucking transphobic and weird in this panel. But
Yeah.
there is something striking about how quickly he associates that with someone who basically devours and destroys children, with an ogre.
Yeah. And it's interesting also that we are in just a new era of the same thing, right? Trans panic, I would say, is at an all-time high, especially politically in 2024.
Yeah.
But how many episodes of RuPaul's Drag Race are there? And it's a very similar thing. That's fine,
Yes.
but
Because
be careful what
ultimately
bathroom you use.
because ultimately you still want to be a cis man at the end of the day.
Right. So
Anyway,
anyway,
that one panel, just it's impossible not to address that, especially for us as,
yeah.
two non-binary trans people looking at this and going,
Ugh.
"Wow." But it doesn't really come up again. We're not going to see a lot of him traipsing around in a dress in the moonlight or whatever. But that's, it's just it's a panel that shows we're not dealing with like woke Spawn here or something. It's not progressive. It's not trying to be reactionary, but it's very of its time, and it's so apolitical that it just doesn't care.
The next scene's going to get us to a bit more juxtaposition. We do get Spawn in a classic trench coat and fedora
Oh yeah,
disguise, which is great.
hanging
But
out with some
right,
houseless people,
and we get
or around some houseless people, just watching them.
yeah, because he just hangs out in this alley, and we get a little bit more juxtaposition of how other cops operate versus Sam and Twitch. They just kind of come barreling through this alleyway, and doesn't seem like something Sam and Twitch would do.
Right. So an anonymous cop car comes barreling through the alley saying, "Cripes, damn bums! I got a robbery in progress." and totally just hits one of these guys with the car, and the rest of the unhoused people are deeply upset because, of course, one of their friends was just crushed by reckless cops.
Yeah.
This wakes Spawn up because the guy starts ranting about Billy Kincaid killing babies, and that's not justice. And this is how Spawn learns that Billy Kincaid is free. This is Spawn's moment. He says, Kincaid, free. Already. It can't. Damn. Keep forgetting. 5 years have gone by. Good. I won't lose out a second time. And this is where we learn about the fact that Spawn was going to kill Kincaid on behalf of his former boss, Jason Wynn, who was his sort of handler and spy master who gave him his targets, who we learned in the first arc betrayed him, which led to his death, which led to him becoming Spawn, so on and so forth. Spawn gives the quick rundown, and it's kind of a cool bit of storytelling, more of these sort of diegetic panel borders where we get this shot of Spawn's kind of face and cape at the top with his chains wrapping down and forming the panel borders. And there are times when this works great for Todd McFarlane and times when it works poorly. This one kind of whips. This really
Yeah.
looks like this little sequence with the chains and everything really has the feeling of sort of a stepping stone on the way to that like JHS Batwoman style, like every panel is the even the shape of panels is part of the art.
I was going to bring up J.H. Williams because I think that as much as I love that stuff, sometimes you look at it and you just go, I have no idea how to read this. Like
That's
it
true.
looks cool. And that's not the problem that this has at all. I think that this is the perfect amount. I kind of wish that the shapes of the chains made more sense. Like I don't know exactly what
Yeah,
it's supposed to be, but
it's
it
very
looks
clear
cool.
that like they're just drawn to fit the page and the shape of the panel.
Yeah.
But I mean they're cool, and also I'm just gonna be honest, it takes a shitload of time to draw that many little chain links.
Yeah,
So sometimes they
100%.
wind up going in a direction where you're like, okay, it's just gonna bend like that right now because that's how I drew it, and I don't have time to go back and erase it again. All right, because I gotta write this thing too, and I gotta market
Yeah.
it, and I gotta go. So it's a cool page though, and it kind of gives Spawn, in his mind, the motivation he needs to get out of this alley and stop sleeping in trash and go figure out his next step after the revelation about his role in the cosmic war between hell and heaven. And the next page is a classic Todd McFarlane Spawn splash page where his cape is just
Huge. It rules.
totally
It's
defying
awesome.
physics. It's just flapping in the wind, and it is awesome. This is a great splash page. I love it.
It's
I'm gonna be honest.
I don't even think his cape splits like that normal. Like I don't think that's what his cape look, but whatever. I guess what we'll find out later is that the whole costume's alive, right? So it doesn't
Yeah,
really matter.
it's
But
making a shape that doesn't make any sense in terms of like its actual movement, but I love it. I don't care.
yeah,
I don't give a shit that it doesn't make physical sense because it looks great, and that's the most important thing in the comic. And so this is also just a page of basically Todd McFarlane giving a Spawn pump up kind of moment where he's like, Spawn is ready to kill again.
this is what he has to do.
So he bypasses Sam and Twitch's stakeout entirely, leaps right over them, and floats right over to Billy Kincaid's house where he peeks in. He's having all these visions of Cyan as he's watching Billy mourn that it's nighttime because he can't go out and pick up more kids to kill.
Yeah, it's
And
honestly it's really haunting, and the exposed gums of Billy Kincaid as he's sort of like
oh,
smiling to himself
it's
is really
terrible.
creepy. I
It
mean,
is
it's good
very
stuff,
creepy. It's a
and
little
I
creepy how much it resembles the smile of Cyan on the opposite panel. I think
yep.
that's intentional. Again, that's another one of those like repeated panels, but I think that's intentional. But Cyan has a mouth like a shark. Like those teeth are really something to look at. And it's just a little unsettling that that's the comparison he's drawing. Again, much like in a lot of that first arc, Todd had these close-up shots of hands, and the positioning of hands were kind of a physical feature that was guiding the reader through the story and really making it a grounded sort of tactile experience. right from the first page of this, there is a lot of close up of Billy Kincaid's face, other people's faces, the way they smile, the way they react to things. That is sort of the motif of this comic itself, is just these close ups on these people's faces. It's almost weirdly John Woo in a way.
Yeah, but we do get to go back to the hands quite a little bit, and I like the Spawn hand busting through the door. I guess it's not totally clear,
Yeah,
but it looks
the
cool, and
wall
I love
maybe.
Spawn's weird claw fingers. And then we get another great splash page. I mean, I
Oh,
will
there's
say
something
this.
too important to note on the page before that, which is that Spawn and Twitch hear, or sorry, Spawn, Sam and Twitch hear Spawn break in because they're on stakeout, and they go, "Oh
Right,
shit, it's that mafia killer." And that is a reference to the first arc where the
which is
Violator is pulling
Violator.
the hearts out of the mafia dons, and we're kind of get the impression like it's being linked to Spawn, and it's kind of so Sam and Twitch think Spawn might be responsible for that. It's an unresolved sort of storyline from the first issue. So they start running for the door. But the next page is another great splash page.
Yeah, where it's just Spawn and Billy Kincaid, and Kincaid is, I guess he's scared. His face doesn't really make out that he's scared,
He
but
seems more
he's just,
confused, and he's just muttering ice cream.
yeah. And we move to the next page, and we realize that Sam and Twitch have are there too late. Whatever they think is going on is no longer happening. They do see the Kincaid's sort of extracurricular artistic activities on the wall.
Yeah, they're
Um,
horrified by that. On that splash page, I want to point out the hands again. Spawn's very lurky, and he's keeping his hands close to his face. But get a look at Billy Kincaid's giant monster hands that are just
yeah,
honestly grotesque. Like,
he's really big in almost every panel he's in.
yeah, he looms very large. I think that's very intentional, much like
Yeah,
him being in shadows. Pretty much he's in shadows until he's home alone and Spawn is coming in on him.
basically, yeah.
So
Um,
yeah, Sam and Twitch bust in, and so we finally get to the payoff. So in between the time it took them from run from the car to Billy Kincaid's door and kick it in because they saw or heard Spawn bust in, Spawn has fully wrapped Billy Kincaid's nude body in chains. Looks like Hellraiser, where they're just like every direction. His
yeah,
entire body is just enveloped in chains, except for his weird Ken doll crotch, which comes up a lot. Which I think is maybe a. Obviously, Todd McFarlane's not going to draw like male genitals openly in his comic here, but
right.
nonetheless, there is a lot of portrayal of Billy Kincaid as very sexless, on top of
Mm,
being a perverted child murderer. And I
yeah.
wonder if there's some sort of intentional or unintentional symbolism of showing that in the
I
first
wonder
place.
if I wonder if it's just as simple as like I need like kids love chains, but kids don't need the villain to be hanging dong
Well, of course,
at the
but
end
like
of the book. Like,
he could have just covered his crotch area is what I'm saying.
true,
That's what's
true.
interesting to me, is that like you don't put a balloon there or chains, or could have been another chain there. It doesn't matter. It's just an interesting point. But what's very interesting to me about this page, he's got an ice cream bar stuck, a popsicle stuck in his mouth. He's got ice cream scoops and sticks all stuck all over his torso, and they are pinning on a note that says boys screamed and girls screamed, so I made him scream and scream and scream. And it is this horrific nightmare image of like what happened to a child murderer, which of course we all know in fiction you can do anything you want to a child murderer. Who's going to step up and be like, don't treat pedophiles that way?
It's pretty much like Nazis and pedophiles, great villains for comics because you can do whatever
Yeah.
you want.
So this page to me is another one of those mission statements, and I've been referring to this until we got here over and over, where this is very much a Hellraiser version of a Spider-Man climax, where the
Yeah,
villain is webbed up. He's hanging from the ceiling with a note that says "Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man," and the cops are arriving to arrest the criminal or whatever that's been detained. That is to me a direct reference in this image. It just has to be, especially given how much Spider-Man Todd McFarlane drew over the years and how known he is for that comic, how associated he is with Spider-Man. That correspondence of imagery to me is absolutely intentional, and it's extremely effective too because it says, and like we said at the top of this discussion, this is the issue that really seems like the mission statement of how Spawn is different from these other heroes that he's compared to in Todd's
Yeah.
career and in terms of his tone and stuff. Batman, Spider Man. He's a guy who's going to find this guy and honestly brutally murder him and leave him in a similar condition where the cops are finding him wrapped up with a note on him, but it's a note that's like physically stabbed into him by ice cream sticks, and he's wrapped up in chains instead of spider webs. Okay, rant over.
Do you think he sharpened the ice cream sticks before
The sticks, I don't know. The one that's really tough to me is that
the
scoop
ice cream
with like
scoop?
that like 2 inch wide like round base. Like,
Yeah.
did that go straight into his? Wow. And it also shows that Spawn is capable of this brutal and frankly instantaneous violence because unless Spawn and Twitch or Spawn, I keep doing that. Unless Sam and Twitch took an incredible scenic route around the neighborhood to get from the car to the door, it's instantaneous how
Yeah.
quick they
Yeah.
that they get through the house and there he is and Spawn's gone.
Yeah. I think this issue, it is like you said, like it is really like to me the mission statement issue, and I love the kind of closing narration because I do think it closes the loop on here's how Sam and Twitch think about justice. Here's how Spawn deals with how Spawn thinks about justice, and it's a really effective one shot.
It
Like
is.
it really works in terms of like, and that's why I keep kind of saying like I think this would have worked really well as the first issue. Like I think if this was the first issue, you don't get a lot of Spawn, and you don't get a lot of like you do get enough sort of backstory stuff because Todd loves to fill us in
Mm.
about Jason Wynn and whatever. And there are definitely details in here that you'd have to rewrite this a bit and kind of like
Yeah,
change things to make it really work as a first issue. But I do think that it's funny. We talked about it last episode about how Todd doesn't really seem all that concerned with like the supernaturally Doctor Strangey elements of Spawn. Other writers end up doing a lot more with that.
and we'll talk
It's
about
kind of
that in a
funny.
minute, frankly.
Well, it's kind of funny that he doesn't care about that stuff, considering it is kind of part of the main conceit of the book.
Right.
But then when you read something like this, you go, oh, right, we don't really care about how he got his powers necessarily. He's just got powers. He hates evil people and he wants to make sure justice is served. Great. And he's better at it than Batman, is kind of like what it comes down to.
But also this is ground spawn very specifically in horror as well as a
Yeah.
superhero comic, even more than the first arc. The first arc has the horror elements of like the Violator ripping out people's hearts and the Malbolgia, the demonic entity and stuff, but this is the one that really sells Spawn as like having the potential to have that kind of Twilight Zone kind of monster of the week horror element as along with the superhero element. I do think this issue has some storytelling hurdles and some pacing hiccups, thanks to the beginning of the book is a lot basically visiting a whole lot of different people as they all have the same reaction and the same kind of inner monologue or narrative captioning that kind of sells the same thing over and over, which is nobody wanted Billy Kincaid out of jail except for Billy Kincaid.
You know what? The first page could literally just say that.
Yeah, exactly.
It could literally just say
It could.
nobody wanted, and like that kind of gets you there. And then if you, anyway, we shouldn't try to rewrite a story that's been out for
But
30 years.
it
But
is interesting though that we're also seeing Todd McFarlane learn to write as we go with
yeah,
this, and we can see how his knowledge and his grasp of visual storytelling and sequential storytelling informs his ability to then write the comic
hmm
because he can think to himself. You can see him very clearly having an idea in his head of how he wants the storytelling to go, and then having to make the dialogue kind of wrap around that. Where I think if he had more experience as a writer going into this, and this is, again, he's only been writing that Spider-Man comic before this, and The writing is not what that comic is known for. He's still very early in his career as a writer here.
Yeah.
There's a lot of that comes with experience, like we talked about at the beginning. There's a lot of instinct and knowledge about what you can do in this medium and with this medium and with the space that you have that comes with experience and that comes with more practice in writing. Like not writing all the like Billy Kincaid's getting out of jail, blah blah blah, going kind of around your ass to get to your elbow, as the saying
Right.
goes, to get
Do
to
do
that point.
you know, to your point about this being Spawn's real first foray into solidifying itself as a horror title at this point anyway,
Hmm.
almost more than a superhero title. Do you think that the first arc almost feels more like 80s horror, partly because it has like literal monsters in it, like Violator being almost just like Violator's kind of deal is he's almost like a Freddy or a Jason or whatever, right? He's just like a killer, and then there's Spawn's there. This feels to me somehow more subversive because it's trying to ground itself in something very real, and it feels I don't know if 90s horror is correct because we also had those kind of like
Sure.
we had Scream and stuff in the
Well, I
90s.
think that definitely that first arc with the Violator feels a lot more superhero-y because you get a lot more of Spawn,
Yeah,
frankly. And also it does have more of a monster movie kind of feel where we know
yeah,
there's a monster and it is a monster in a monster's body doing monstrous things. This to me, I compared that last panel to Hellraiser with the chains, but I'll compare it a lot deeper to that in the sense that this has that kind of not necessarily cerebral but more emotional horror,
mm,
and even visually and kind of thematically, a demon is showing up to wrap this guy in chains and destroy his body and take him to hell. You know, there's that very Clive Barker kind of, trying to think of the right word. There's almost an irony in it. There's almost a little bit of playfulness in the horror in terms of like the way Spawn tacks that note to him. It's almost a punchline based on what he's saying to the whole issue. There's a little bit more of that emotional play in it than just straightforward like slasher stuff. I
yeah,
think
yeah. I mean, it's more subversive, and I think it's more effective. And there's nothing actually that scary in the first four issues,
no, it's a lot more supernatural. It's a lot
right?
more large and arch and kind of like
And I would say that this is not it's not out and out scary, but it is unsettling. Billy Kincaid in his existence is unsettling, and as a reader, you understand that pretty quickly. And so you and it I mean ultimately you get a great kind of that last page is like you kind of cheer for it because you're like cool, great,
yeah,
love
again, it's
Spawn.
one of those things where like the emotionality of this comic is all based around how little everyone wants this guy to be free, how
Yeah,
pissed off they are that the due process, the process of justice that they believe in was subverted or
yeah,
denied. And there's even the guy literally begging for that specific catharsis of a
yeah,
superhero to come and kill or violently punish this guy. And so by the end, it is definitely intended to make the reader be like, good, fist in the air, Spawn fucking brutally, brutally murdered this guy. And, we don't actually see the murder. That's something interesting as well. We see Spawn kind of lurk up, and then we see Sam and Twitch be like, oh, fuck, we have to get inside, run for the door. They run through the house, and then we get to the back of the house, and they see the aftermath. And that's definitely less like a slasher movie or a monster movie, where in those stories, the kill is the point, seeing the
right,
kill, getting that visceral thrill. Whereas in something that's more like Seven, for example, is a good example. I mentioned David Fincher in that one page. I think that's another example that is, that movie came out, I think, a year after this. But
I mean it's a 90s movie, so yeah,
nonetheless, I just think the parallels are interesting. Seven is not about the murder, it's about the aftermath of the murder. You don't see John Doe going around and performing these murders, you see the aftermath and you see the
right,
impact, and it's about the impact. And I think that that's the same kind of instinct that leads to the ending here. Todd isn't trying to show you Spawn ripping out, Billy Kincaid's guts. He's trying to show you the impact of that. And also, you see in that same panel, Sam standing in the doorway, totally silhouetted. And you kind of get that this leaves him a little desolate too, because he'll never get true justice. He'll never get to prove in court how evil Billy Kincaid really is and show the world that, there is a way to serve true justice, which, as he's monologued several times and as the accompanying narration for his scenes has shown, is ultimately his goal. What he wants is for justice to be served.
Absolutely. This is going to lead us into our next Billy Kincaid issue, unless you have any last thoughts, but I feel like you just got them out.
Yeah, I think that covers it. Let's talk about Spawn number 8. And like we
So
said,
we're skipping.
we're gonna skip ahead 2 issues. We'll come back to 6 and 7 because they are their own arc. We're gonna talk about issue 8 because it is a direct sort of sequel to
Follow up,
follow
yeah.
up to issue 5 that deals with Billy Kincaid, and it's also kind of a standalone. So we're gonna pair
Yeah,
these
so
together as a sort of parallel. So don't worry
let,
that we're going 5 to 8. We are going to talk about 6 and 7.
yeah. So that's going to bring us to Spawn number 8, In Heaven. Story by Alan Moore, art by Todd McFarlane.
In
Letters
heaven,
and editor,
everything is fine, and that's an important reference. That is an Eraserhead reference.
correct. Letters and editor Tom Orzakowski. Color by Steve Oliff, Ruben Rude, and Ollie Optics. This one is dedicated to Don and Maggie Thompson.
Okay,
So
I think Maggie Thompson is the name of the. Isn't she the name of the like police chief down the road or something like that? I'm almost certain there's a Maggie Thompson. I could look it up right now because I do have a guide of all the people that Todd McFarlane has named people after in this comic. But I'm pretty sure that those names come up in this comic again.
they
And
are the longtime editors of the Comics Buyer's Guide.
aha,
So they are in the industry, and
I
yeah,
think I could be totally wrong. I could be totally wrong, and maybe that's where I recognize those names from. But I feel like anyway, I'm not going to keep going on about that. I could be totally off base. We'll find out later.
so
Not
this
necessarily
is
relevant now.
this issue kicks off a period of 4 issues in a row that Todd is going to get some guest writers to come in. And as we kind of mentioned before, Todd seems pretty happy to keep Spawn as a street level hero and to not delve too deeply into the supernatural stuff. But this is an issue where Alan Moore is going to delve deeper into what Malbolgia meant when he said, like, hey, you're going to kill bad guys and then they're going to join my army. Well, what does that mean? And the first thing of note is the narration is very specifically in the same lettering style that we saw from Billy Kincaid in his issue. Everything's lowercase. He has these like weird little accent marks over the eyes, so we can tell that the voice is his. And the first page, has this sort of like necroplasm pod with Spawn flying kind of in between, which I don't know that Spawn really flies at this point.
We've seen him
Um,
glide a little bit or jump.
yeah, like
Um,
jump.
yeah,
Um,
but it's this brain stem followed by a sort of like kind of half formed, almost zombie-ish looking body, and then we see the fully formed body of Billy Kincaid in this pod. And what this issue is going to be is basically Billy's Inferno. Like it's basically Billy Kincaid venturing through layers of hell, meeting other people, witnessing their fates, and then learning his own. That is the easiest way I can sort of summarize the plot of this issue. But on the way there, it's going to get very weird. It's going to get very, very dark. And it's going to get, in some cases, bafflingly sexual.
we kind of talked about this before recording. Did Todd have an idea for these issues and like give some notes and say, hey, writers who are not me, just kind of go for it? I kind of lean towards no, and that they just got to do whatever they want because like this issue and then Gaiman's issue, Miller's issue, and
Dave Sim.
Dave Sims' issue are so wildly different. It kind of sounds like they pitched him like, I don't know, this is what I was thinking, and he went okay.
Well, the background that I
Um,
know about the situation is that Todd McFarlane's writing on the first arc of Spawn was very criticized. We've not necessarily been critical, but we have been, I will say we've been critical about it, but we've been kind of analyzing that as we go ourselves. And Todd's response was, "I'm going to hire who I think are the four best writers in comics. I'm going to pay them $100,000 each to write a Spawn comic, and that's it. No contracts. That'll come up later." Uh, and I think your second instinct there is correct. I think Todd said, "I want the Alan Moore version of this. I want Alan Moore's Spawn. I want you to do you." The funny thing about that is Alan Moore really captures Todd McFarlane's voice on this in a lot of ways. It's a little more puerile. It's a little more rough than a lot of Alan Moore's dialogue is in many cases, and it it's kind of funny. It starts with Billy Kincaid busting out of this pod covered in slime. Again, we see he has no genitals. That'll come up several times in this comic, just the way he's drawn. He does have a huge dumpty ass, which is also on this panel. He busts out and he says, I have a problem with this naked stuff. I'm gonna kill a lizard and wear its skin." It's
all right.
then he says, "It's nice knowing you can still kill things when you're dead."
I mean, the thing that I was most struck by in this issue is all the other stuff going on. Like, I like the world that this is all taking place in, this like weird jungle demon whatever. There's like behind some of the panels, there's like little weird demon monsters like eating each other and fight like chasing each other. And there's like skulls everywhere.
Yeah, Todd has
And
fun with a lot of these panels. Some of them you can tell he was like, "I need a lot of more background than I have, so here's 5 lines."
yeah, well, and also too, it is, I think, in the same way that Moore is like getting into Todd McFarlane's like, well, I'm doing an issue with Alan Moore, and I love Alan Moore, so I'm gonna like kind of do a Swamp thing,
Yeah, it
like
does have that with all the green and a lot of this very organic backgrounds and stuff. Those bats flying everywhere, and smoke. There.
yeah,
Oh, so the next thing that happens is that Billy, while he's just eating the remains of this lizard and hanging out in his lizard loincloth, meets the rest of the cast of this issue. And it's like Little Kid, Bimbo, Brooklyn, Fatty, and Fat Brooklyn. Like, it's just these 5 generic characters. The most disturbing of which to me is Kimberly, who has the
uh,
upspeak thing of ending all her sentences with question marks, something that Billy Kincaid points out later, who is drawn very sexy. And the first thing she says is, "My name's Kimberly and I have like an eating disorder."
which so is that why she's in hell?
We
Is
don't
is
know.
is Alan Moore essentially, considering some things that will be said later in this issue, is Alan Moore conflating, and I guess this would be like a very like I guess kind of Catholic thing, right? Like there was the idea that if you
Yes.
if you if like you know committed suicide, that you had committed a sin and that like you wouldn't go to heaven,
There's
right?
also, aspects of gluttony, which are things like food denial and that sort of thing, which is sort of a
Yeah.
weird. One thing I will
Do you,
say about old Kimberly here is that she is not drawn like she has a particularly profound eating disorder, in that Todd McFarlane draws her very curvaceously sexy,
yeah.
nipples bursting through her shredded clothes. The other people are naked except for the child, thankfully. We're very glad about that. And we do see that Billy has noticed her very profoundly. He introduces himself as Chili, Mr. Chili, which was the name on his ice cream
Ice cream
truck.
truck.
He says,
Yeah.
My name's Billy Kincaid, but Mr. Chili is my professional name." So I guess that's, him kind of beginning his ice cream man act for this kid.
I
They
will
start to
say
wander. Oh, go ahead.
the as they this kind of little crew kind of comes together, the closing like kids cute though. being like the last words on the page, especially having just read 5 before this. You're just like, oh no, this is not good.
Yeah,
Like
it's
like it
there.
like it brings back that same unsettling feeling that you get from that last issue, and kudos to Moore for being able to kind of hone in on that. It's simple. Maybe I'm making a mountain out of a molehill there, but
No, I
as soon
mean,
as I
but
read that, I was like, ugh.
there is a sense of impending dread of Billy Kincaid meeting this child, even in hell, that follows you throughout the issue, which is its most effective storytelling tactic, especially when you get to sort of the punchline of the end. And again, this is another issue that has that sort of feeling of a Twilight Zone episode where there is kind of a, I hate to call it a punchline, but a sort of point at the end. There is a sort of reveal at the end that twists everything we just saw into a very different and frankly much weirder situation. But for now, it's pretty freaking weird because Kimberly, who has an eating disorder, explains that she feels really weird because like she does a lot of spirit channeling is what she says and talking to dead people, and none of them mention the fact that there are 10 dead realms, 10 dead lands,
Well,
10
and
sort of
the
spheres of hell.
child, the kid is like the one who's like the like very knowledgeable.
Yes.
She's like, oh, there's 10 levels of hell, and this is just a reception area, and it's like, all right, sure.
Yeah, and
Now, is the channeling why Kimberly's in hell?
who the fuck knows? That's the thing about this is that all we get from these characters are very sort of writ large, frankly, in some ways offensive stereotypes because the next thing that happens is this being that appears to be an angel shows up and asks, who sings the songs of comfort and joy. And the black woman that is with them says, I do, and starts singing gospel and is taken away by this creature who the child says is not an angel, but a demon who is taking her off to one of the other realms of hell. There's some very Alan Moore writing here, which is not, in a way that is not his best aspect, where he has Billy Kincaid decide that the kid is autistic and that she's
An-
disturbed. He kind of equates those words in a way that I think is kind of
another
nasty.
another like again, I think autism at the time a thing that people understood even less than they do now, and it became a bit of like a fallback. You see it, and not to bring up X Men again, I don't mean to keep doing that, but it's sort of the comic I read most in the '90s. It comes up there too, where like it's like, oh, you know, they're autistic, and you're like, now we're like, that's not what that means.
Yeah.
It's not
Well, in
what,
the
it's not what you
90s,
mean at
you
all.
were coming out of the most public portrayal of the concept of autism being Rain Man,
Rain Man,
which is
right?
about, the autistic savant, and he is very it's a very stereotypical and frankly offensive portrayal of what autism is. And in this case, it's another one of those things, much like Billy Kincaid murdering a child in drag in the first issue, where it's shorthand for something, but it's shorthand for something fucking stupid and offensive.
Yeah, I do like that more actually almost. I don't want to say he fixes it. He rehabilitates that panel slightly because Billy kills something else and wears its skin. Like if the idea is just that that's what he does,
Right. That
it's
he's, yeah.
not better. I don't want to say it's better.
No, I mean, it's,
I just think that it's like, oh, okay, is that just part of his process? I can't believe I'm saying any of this.
no, but
You know
is
what I'm
he's
saying?
he's in some ways dehumanizing this child to himself by diagnosing her with this mental illness. Also, I don't think that is a panel that is meant to be Alan Moore being like, here's my portrayal of
Yeah.
autism.
Well,
Or
yeah,
Billy
that's
Kincaid being like, I sincerely think this child has autism spectrum disorder. I don't think it's any of those. I think it's just not the Arsler
yeah,
here, you know?
yeah.
I
I don't
guess
know.
it's good that it's
It's
not that, but
better,
it's
I
not, it's
guess.
still very ableist and it's very weird.
Yeah, it's not
Honestly,
good.
we harp on these moments. Just like one word out of a panel. That one panel in the last issue, it seems maybe oversized to dig into these, but processing this and talking about these things is kind of to me part of analyzing comics of the time. And
Hmm.
part of what makes them interesting to read is that for me, by processing when they fail at meeting a standard of kind of just being chill at, you know, when they have like things like offensive stereotypes or terms, or portrayals, it helps me to further appreciate what's good about the comics personally by also accepting and pointing out and just frankly stating what's bad about them in a lot of ways.
And I think it's important to contextualize these moments because I've definitely met a lot of people who, especially with this book has a weird reputation with comics fans where there are a lot of, especially modern comics fans, who are like, that book is bad. That would then be like, all right, I'm going to read Spawn and kind of dig into these issues. Especially, I would say, newer comics fans who like were not reading at the time of this, that don't have the context of what was going on at the time. So I do appreciate that we kind of dig into that. I will say that despite that panel being pretty rough, the next page is an all-time banger.
Oh, it's sick, man.
Oh, it's so good.
It's awesome. It's Billy Kincaid falling asleep and dreaming of being enveloped by Spawn all night. And you got this like the main portion of the image is Spawn's face and his hands kind of enveloping Billy as he lays back and like kind of in a very fainting kind of pose and is just fully wrapped up in Spawn's cape and his claws and his clutches and his chains all around his neck. But then you
So
have this
cool.
picture at the bottom of Spawn kind of curtsying, which is very funny to me. I don't think that's what that pose is meant to be, but it's certainly what it looks like. But this has the imagery here and the composition really feels like one of those old classic like Frank Robbins Batman covers from the 40s and
100%.
50s, or like the early Spectre covers, or the ones like the I think was it the William Messner Loeb Spectre covers from the
Hmm.
70s and 80s that just look so sick. There's like a very, I don't know, kind of Tales from the Crypt kind of thing going on here that's really
The
great.
the funniest thing for me is there are four spawns on this page. I love the third spawn whose back is to us, but
Yes,
he's pointing at the other spawn like just to like lead you. It almost leads your eye. The spawns lead your eye on the page, which is great.
they do.
Um,
And that
but
also
it's
makes
really
it almost
funny.
look like he's dancing around with his.
Yeah. It's this it's oh my god. What's that Oscar Isaac movie? It's just that scene, but it's Spawn dancing.
Was it Ex Machina? Is that the one?
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
um
It's his dancing on the stairs moment. So the next couple of pages are a couple of quick re-deaths for the other members of Spawn's little traveling party, or Spawn Billy Kincaid's little traveling party here. Because basically what's
yeah,
happening is they're
being
traveling.
assigned to their levels of hell,
Yes, they're
essentially.
being taken to different levels of hell based on their qualities. First thing that happens is a beam out of the sky disintegrates Larry, the restaurant owner and drug deal fatality from Michigan.
So what he did wrong was he
He
died
had
in a
died
drug
in a
deal,
drug deal.
or that he owned a restaurant. I mean, maybe that
Who
will
knows?
send you to
Maybe you said
hell.
he
I
was
don't.
from Michigan, Pierce. Maybe that alone is enough to send you there in Alan Moore's like cosmology here. That's the thing, is that we have to view this through both Alan Moore and Todd McFarlane's lens. In the sense that like, what does Alan Moore think sends you to hell at this point? That's fascinating. So the kid tells him that was the prime monad from the highest sphere, the 10th. He handpicks souls to use as circuitry in his macro computer. Your friend is lucky. And there's a
Thanks,
lot of
Alan.
that in this There's a lot of like Blorbo took him to the Gugar dimension from, and it's like cool, man. Alan Moore is establishing a lot of language and a lot of terms that are, some of which are going to come up again, and some of which are going to be like, cool, the prime monad. Great.
I love the next one. I love how Bob gets taken. He sees Elvis, but it's like demon Elvis who's got cool eyes like on his lapels and stuff and a
Yeah.
tentacle for an arm.
Yeah. He's
Um,
like the anglerfish demon version of Elvis. And the guy's like, oh, hell yeah, it's the king. And he says, I was listening to American Trilogy when I ran my pickup under that Peterbilt, which, what a song to pick. That's for those who aren't familiar and didn't grow up in the American South. American Trilogy is a song that is primarily Confederate songs. That's like Glory, Glory, Hallelujah, and shit like that, that are like, especially where I live, associated with, well, yeah, like the Confederacy and stuff like that. So we get the idea that Bob here is kind of a redneck, and maybe that's what he went to hell for, is being a
I mean,
redneck.
he got hit by a Mack truck.
Yeah,
That's what a
he drove
Peterbilt is.
under it. Yeah, he drove under it.
Yeah.
So
So,
we get maybe he it seems like he was like decapitated by a truck.
which in this case, I'm like, okay, he's not a great guy, I guess.
Certainly not a good
I
driver.
he probably believes the South will rise again, and all right, that's why he's in hell. We can extrapolate some other things there, I guess.
The thing about this is, in Alan Moore's cosmology for Spawn, there is such a low bar for what gets you into hell. Now, the other thing is, it's possible that none of these people even exist because of what happens at the end of this story. We kind of get
True.
rid of Kimberly real fast on the next page by having her be like, "Oh, this looks just like a crystal I had," and then she touches this crazy, ugly, pointy rock that looks like a Bazor and gets sucked into it because it turns out to be like a sleeping weird demon spider. And
Cool.
Billy is clutching this child now as Kimberly gets carried away. And that is just one of the most unsettling images in this comic. In a comic full of like people traveling through hell and having their souls mutilated and stuff, the image of the guy we know wants to do nothing more than literally disassemble this child
Yeah.
is clutching her close. And we get another dream sequence, another kick-ass like page of Spawn crouching over Billy Kincaid, a giant Spawn, almost like, again, I called back. I think it's a Frank Robbins cover of the Joker leering over Gotham, looming over Gotham with his guns drawn. Almost has that kind of like very like horror superhero crossover
Yeah.
vibe.
I love how his arm starts getting all distended
It almost
and
looks like
weird.
Violator's arm,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I
more and
mean,
more demonic.
I think I feel like Todd's like, oh man, I gotta pull out all the stops for Alan Moore, and he's just
Definitely.
like, let's go.
And then we've got these like again another shot of Billy Kincaid and his weird full frontal Ken dollness, which again I understand you're not going to draw Billy Kincaid's dick and balls, but
Maybe one, maybe give us at least one ball, I
yeah,
guess.
well maybe there kind of is one little nub in there, but
Yeah,
you could have covered that angle with a chain, and Todd McFarlane keeps taking great angles to show that like he's a weird, vulnerable, sexless nothing when he's in
yeah.
Spawn's clutches.
We move on to sort of what we've thought we've been building to this entire time, which is if there's a child and Billy Kincaid, he's going to try to kill them. But surprise, that's not a kid.
It's not a kid at all. It's a demon. And this page is actually pretty great storytelling wise. The
Yeah,
panels get slightly taller as they go, making it kind of like you get that looming like suspense build through the shape and structure of the panels that are honestly fairly straightforward but well constructed and well measured. You see him waking up in a cold sweat, looming over the child, and then he's like, I just got to get this over with. Just got to get it over with. Get it out of my system, and then maybe the dreams will stop. He grabs her to start strangling her, and her face starts cracking apart like glass or like a porcelain doll's face. And suddenly, what bursts out is a guy who looks not too much unlike the Violator. We get another splash page of Billy cowering in front of this giant demon that looks like the Violator, but with like Catwoman eyes.
yeah. I
Oh,
like
it's a great design.
Vindicator.
Yes, he says, I'm the Vindicator, one of the 5 famous Phlebiac Brothers. I guess you probably heard of us. And Billy Kincaid and I are both just like, no, I haven't heard of the fucking 5 Phlebiac Brothers, dog. That's intense.
This is a little bit of like Alan Moore being like, you know what's happening in Captain Britain? There's a multiverse. There's a million Captain Britons. Don't worry about it. He's like, Phlebiac Brothers? They didn't have a name before, but that's what they are.
Haven't you heard of the 5 Phlebiac Brothers?
I like that they're brothers. Like, I don't
Yeah,
know. It's
there's
such
like
a silly.
it's
And he also apologizes for entrapping Billy Kincaid. He's like, sorry about the entrapping.
yeah,
Like, okay.
but he basically establishes that what he wants is to take Billy Kincaid to the 8th sphere.
Right.
And Billy sees this tower that's like all covered in skulls. It's honestly kind of sick. It looks very much like that. I think it's still a Mike Dringenberg Sandman in the 80s
Oh,
when he
yeah.
goes to get his helm back from Lucifer.
Also hell.
Yeah, exactly. That's very well. I'm saying I think it takes a lot of inspiration from that. And again, it's that 80s kind of mature Vertigo feeling. Billy's like, "Oh, I can escape to that tower," and he starts climbing so many stairs, and he's like climbing them, clinging to him. This splash page of Billy Kincaid kind of clinging to these sort of very non-Euclidean curving spiraling stairs as the Vindicator chases him is very, very cool, and it sells the desperation that Billy Kincaid is really feeling. There's a lot of really solid splash pages in this issue, and again, we've talked about before that there's times when Todd McFarlane loves to use a splash page that he probably could get away with not. But in this one, like you said, he's really going big for Alan Moore, and as a result, I think a lot of the pages, the splash pages, actually work. They work as almost like chapter breaks in this kind of single issue, and they kind of work as, again, sort of that episodic very much like Alan Moore's Inferno kind of feeling. So Billy Kincaid's trying to escape through this tower, but of course, the Vindicator catches him, tells him he's going to take him to the eighth level of hell.
As much as you were saying like Alan Moore's Inferno, we're really going to get that in the next kind of double page spread. Vindicator is going to explain each of the levels and what sort of torture you go through. And for an issue that overall I'm kind of lukewarm on because I'm like, I don't want to spend this much time with Billy Kincaid. He's not a
He's
character.
not a good guy. He's not a
Yeah,
good guy.
he's not a character that I care to like. I don't care what happens to Billy Kincaid.
Yeah, I'm
And
glad he's in
this
hell. I don't really need to know the specifics.
I could argue that it doesn't have to be Billy. It could be literally anybody that Spawn has killed. However, this to this point in the book this is the main person he's killed so far.
Hmm.
Like this is the only time he's like
Killed a
he-
human so far.
held and held up to like Malbolgia's ask, right? The mission that he's been given. The only person he's done that so far with that we've seen is Billy Kincaid, and so it does make sense, but you
And
could kind of have slotted this in anywhere with any character, and I think maybe
true.
it's slightly less effective, but
But you also see very much the process of what happens to a soul when that person gets killed by Spawn. So we see all eight levels of hell in this nice little two-page spread where like he goes the second place. He's like the second level you can become a fur coat for some hyper intelligent ice shrimp. On the third sphere you get filleted and served with a light pastry. And there's all kinds of stuff going on. In the fourth, he'd be a fuel rod. I don't even know what that
on the fifth
means.
he'd be nose candy for some fifth sphere hippie meta squid.
Which that is
Uh,
the level of language that's being thrown around in this comic through this whole thing. We're not pausing to talk about every single one of these, but a lot of it is like fucking fifth sphere hippie meta squid, and it's like that's one of the more easily extractable ones. But there's this thing that's kind of easy to get sucked into, this Tolkien-esque kind of thing where you're like, that's the hill of this guy and the sword of this guy and the whatever, whatever, whatever. Alan Moore is trying to throw, excuse me, a lot of cosmology into this issue, and specifically into this two-page spread, which ends with the eighth level, which is the place. Vindicator says, "Now this is the place you're gonna like. Some call it the eighth sphere, some call it the Malbolge, but me, I call it home." And here on the next two pages, we see that Billy Kincaid is being burned by fire and consumed by what appears to be a replica of Spawn's costume. This is very interesting.
we find out that it's a little bit more than that, as Vindicator lets us know. Let me introduce K3 Mirlu. She's a constantly evolving neural parasite, and I think she likes you.
So, this is where we learn that the Spawn costume is actually a neural parasite. Okay? And the page where it envelops Billy Kincaid is another great fucking splash page. Well, I guess it's really almost got panels, but they're broken
Yeah,
up by the main image of the Spawn costume kind of ripped open, spreading around almost like a Venom symbiote. And I just love the way Todd McFarlane draws it here. I love the way
yeah.
the mask is split into two pieces and kind of spreading out. I love his weird ribbony arms, the chains grasping and grappling Billy Kincaid. It's just a really fun, cool panel.
It's a page that adheres to Todd's like artistic outlook, which is like don't learn to draw things from real life, learn to draw things from comics because things in comics don't look like real life and they shouldn't look like real life, right? They should look like comic books. And it's also I'd say he does kind of fall into the like Jack Kirby school of make every moment look like the biggest thing that's happening, even if it's a
Right.
small moment. And that gets followed up with, unfortunately, I do think that the next page is like not quite as strong. And I kind of wish that the first two panels on the next page didn't exist, like where we see the, is it, I guess it's blood slash the
It's the
suit
ooze of the
itself,
costume. It's the
right?
ooze of the suit oozing around him that looks like sprays of blood and spatters of goo.
Yeah.
But it does kind of undersell what we just saw on the previous page, which is like this huge splash page that's very involved and kind of abstract. I agree that the first two panels kind of undersell it. And the last thing that happens on this page, and really the last thing that happens in the issue, is we see Billy Kincaid now in a Spawn suit. And it basically looks exactly like Spawn's costume, except it's Billy Kincaid, so he's a short, fat guy. And he is being locked, or sorry, the gates of hell are literally opening before him. He's being shoved through where we see that there's all kinds of other spawns. We're getting the idea that everyone that Al Simmons kills is going to be turned into one of these spawns with one of these neural parasites.
Yeah, and I what I love is when he's getting pushed through the gates because it's kind of like a symbiote, right? It like bonds to him, and the Vindicator kind of tells us this. He's upset, and so like the points of the cape are drooping,
Yes.
like,
Yeah.
and he's sort of like he's like hunched over, and he's like kind of sad,
It's like
and he's
Bugs Bunny when
crying.
he's all wet.
Yeah, and so like the spawn cave's kind of like drooped over, and it actually makes then Al's suit make more sense, like why it kind of stands at attention so much when he's ready
It,
to do something.
it sells the idea really specifically and openly that the way the costume looks is part of the character's body language.
Yeah,
And so the dialogue on this page is really funny. He says Billy Kincaid is mourning. He says the afterlife shouldn't be this way, full of alien monsters processing humans as if they were cattle, and nobody caring about good or evil, as if he wouldn't just be evil.
yeah. Vindicator's
Um,
like, good or evil, give me a break.
yeah, he says good, evil, give me a break. He says, we're running a business here, and I tell you for nothing, the two words carved on marble in Hell's lobby ain't good or evil. It's two other words, and what they say is this. And here we get a moment where I really wish we could have just gone fully PG-13
Yeah,
because Vindicator says, caca happens, little buddy. Caca happens.
should just be shit
It
happens.
should
It'd
just
be
say
so
shit
much better.
happens. Just say it, man.
Yeah,
Or even just fucking give me a Grolix. Give me anything but caca. Here's the thing. Caca probably has more impact in non-English speaking countries. I think it's Spanish or Portuguese is where it's derived from, and so it has maybe more impact as something closer to shit. But you might as well be saying in U.S. English, it comes off as very childish and not even puerile, but just kind of like very weird. And I don't want to harp on it too much because it's just a word choice, but it sort of undersells
the
the
moment.
the moment of like
Yeah.
you're in deep shit. You're in deep caca, bud. Is not the same as
Especially because Malbolgia looks cool. Like Malbolgia is cool. I was like looking for kind of any little cameos amongst the tiny spawns, but I don't think there are any.
this is really before they started doing, there's different types of spawns, which is going to happen immediately in issue number 9, which we'll get
Yeah.
to down the road after we do go back and do 6 and 7. We'll get to that, and that is going to be a very interesting and formative story for Spawn as a comic and as a property and Tom McFarlane as a person. So look forward to that when we get to it. But yes, this panel of Malbolgia sitting on his throne, cackling with all the many hell spawns at his feet, and Billy Kincaid standing there looking terrified is again one final splash page to close out the standalone story. And overall, it's an interesting story. Issue number 8, Spawn number 8.
It's funny. I think before we started recording, we were like, "Oh, there's like not that much." And this one was like, there are swings, I will say. It almost feels like if Alan Moore's like, "Well, if I'm gonna get paid a bunch of money to just do one, I might as well like write some stuff that I could probably come back and do more, especially if this
Right.
guy's going to keep paying me. And it does start to make us understand what hell is. It interestingly shows us that Malbolgia is not the devil. Like he is not in charge of
The
all of
devil,
hell,
yeah, there's
you
other
know?
portions of hell that he doesn't touch and that are outside of his reach and that are ruled
Right.
presumably by other demons.
Right, exactly. And that it introduces just an interesting idea that it's going to take a little bit for Spawn the book to really grapple with, but it does. I mean, it does kind of put those things in motion and in no uncertain terms move the chains a little bit on building out Spawn's world because I think to this point we've covered five other issues. There's not a lot of there's not a lot of lore yet
No.
on. There's like some brief explanation more than there's any just kind of table setting, but only just enough so that you can eat. Not not like so that you can be excited about what's going to come down the line, if that makes sense.
And a lot of that exposition that you do get is very much kind of filtered in with the exposition of Spawn's human life as Al Simmons, what that meant, how that is going to relate and has already related to his time as a Hell Spawn. And so this is the first issue that takes place entirely away from Earth. This is the first
Right.
issue where we only see Spawn as a concept, really. We
Hmm.
don't ever see him as anything but the creature that is haunting Billy Kincaid's nightmarish dreams.
And we don't get what to this point have been pillars of what Spawn is, right? We don't get like what the Spawn universe is to us. We get, on top of not getting any Al, we get no references to Al's backstory or his history. We don't get Wanda. We don't get Sam and Twitch. So this is, I think, both of these one shots work really well to help develop the idea and the overall concept of Spawn. Because the thing is too, I think even in reading this, if this was the only Spawn issue I'd ever read, knowing again the general public perception of Spawn, I'd be like, yeah, this tracks. I guess Spawn's some shit in hell. Got it.
Spawn's some shit in hell, man. But yeah, no, that is true. And this kind of the two Billy Kincaid issues are more of a mission statement about what Spawn is really going to be about overall than that opening arc actually is in a lot of ways.
Yeah,
That opening arc is very much Todd McFarlane finding his feet, figuring out how to draw and write a comic that doesn't have, decades of history prior to it. And honestly, I think for himself figuring out the tone he wants Spawn to have. Those first four issues feel very much like a superhero story. It's more supernatural, it's a little darker and hellish, more hellish, and there's a lot of violence in it, but it's very much a more straightforward kind of superhero arc of like, this is who I was, this is how I became, this is who I am now as a hero, and I have a very clear villain that I'm going to be fighting.
right. And we're gonna see that more in the next arc that we cover with Overt Kill, hilariously created with
Overt
on
kill.
yeah, hilariously created on Comic Book Greats with Stan Lee and Rob Liefeld.
Very funny little piece of history to track down there. My favorite
Yeah,
part of that is when Rob Liefeld draws some fucking character and Stan Lee's like, what are we going to call him? And Rob Liefeld's, you're gonna call my lawyer or some shit like that. Like he's like, yeah, call my lawyer about that.
I want to bring a little bit of attention to the so in the letters column of issue 5, Todd already knows that he's getting guest writers, so he knows that way ahead of time. 3 months ahead at least at that point, if not more. And also, but there's obviously there are letters columns and things. In issue 8, he announces the Spawn slash Image All World Fan Club, or SAIWFC. So
Sauk
that's COFs,
doesn't quite
whatever.
have the impact of like Foom
No,
or
it
the
doesn't.
Merry Marvel Marching Society.
But also, what's really interesting are the types of letters that they would publish in Spawning Ground, which is the name of the letters column. So here's one. Dear Todd McFarlane, Spawn really bites. Why don't you learn how to write a decent story? You put far too much dialogue into each story. I have to skip over most of the dialogue because I often get tired of reading. Your writing is so wordy that it clutters up your art. I think that Spawn is far too violent. I don't like the idea of a hero who kills. A hero who kills is no better than the criminals he fights. Spawn is a character that kids should not look up to. Lastly, before you write me off as a crackpot, I would like to inform you that I have a college degree in accounting and I have a professional level job. I have been reading comic books for over 15 years. I know what I'm talking about. I would like you to answer one question. Why, Todd? Why do you constantly bash Marvel Comics at every chance you get? Marvel helped to make you a very successful person. Why do you hate Marvel so much? Is it true that at a distributors meeting you said that quote Marvel is a training ground for future image artists? This is one quote we sure won't hear in Wizard. Yours truly,
Peter
Kent
David.
Kochi.
Oh.
Kent Kochi of Sacramento, California. Todd responds, I have a college degree myself and I'm a crackpot, so education does not prevent crackpotitis. If you're looking for a comic book with few words and no violence, watch cartoons with the volume down. You're damn right I'll go after the best artists at Marvel Comics. That's business, not Marvel bashing. As for my Marvel bashing, if you can't understand a person's frustration of being held back in their job, then you must have the greatest job and the greatest boss in the world. And I highly recommend that you keep both for as long as you can.
I just there's so much to unpack between both of those. Like first off, I want to say there are times with comics that I look at it and I go, man, they really, really felt fucking great about the words in that script, didn't they? I had to get them all on the page. And sometimes comics are too wordy. Sometimes, though, I don't know. It's just before you dismiss my opinions, I'm an accountant. Like,
Yeah,
as funny and as non sequitur as that seems, it also kind of shows that, like, especially in the '90s, there was a perception that comics were not for normies. They were for
right.
goofy goons, and that if you were a comic reader, you were probably a Cheeto stained like basement dweller.
You were a comic book guy from The Simpsons.
And this guy's saying, "Excuse you, I'm an accountant."
That's very juxtaposed with the next letter, which I'm not going to read the whole thing. That is a woman who's an editor at Dark Horse Comics, Diana Schultz, who is just like, hey, this book slams. And she ends it with, I don't understand the rancor you've generated among some high minded critics. You're obviously doing what you want to do without some corporate conglomerate reaching into its heartless hands deep into your pockets, and you've been inordinately successful so far. That and the fact you're pissing off a lot of people is a sure sign you're doing something right. Keep it up, Toddy. I'm rooting for you all the way. And he says, wow, finally, someone who gets it. But I never said I was going to do high art, and I'm not here to set the world afire. My whole goal in this thing is to do a job I like on my own terms. I don't see what all the big fuss is about. If most people look at their own parents or brothers, they'll see that most of them did not stay in the same company for their entire career. We at Image are no different then.
I think that's interesting and funny because it points to something that I think is a divide to this day, maybe even more so to this day, between fans and creators, which is where for a fan who has this deep special interest and love for these characters a lot of the time, their whole life might be thinking about Spider-Man. But for a writer or a creator, a artist, inkers, letterers, the whole process, it's a job and a job that has to get done and a product that has to get created. And at some point, they have to move on from just doing that one issue. They have to go to the next one and the next one and the next one. Is that sometimes a failing of the industry? Yes. But I think the fact that Todd McFarlane in this letter column and really with Spawn is just like, no, this is my job. I'm trying to do my job here. Please let me do my job. I'm just trying to do my
Yeah.
job the way I want to do my job. Is I feel like very relatable and puts an interesting lens on how he's going through this and how Spawn will continue to evolve.
And it really puts a spotlight on these guest writer issues, right? Because of course he got the best. Okay, he got letters saying, hey, you suck at writing. He said, okay, I'll get the best writers.
Yeah, and I can do that because I can pay them to do this job better than anyone else can. Which
Yeah.
100K for a single issue, I don't think even like Neil Gaiman and Alan Moore were making in the 90s.
Oh, I feel like Neil Gaiman might have been okay from Sandman.
I don't know if he was making that much though, like 100K an issue. Either way, Maybe he
Fair.
was, but
And
for
Alan Moore is coming off of Watchmen and Swamp Thing. I
certainly
mean, I know
not
they're
in,
years
in
before, but
2024. No one's going to a writer and saying, like, the average comic writer is just from comics and saying, here's $100,000 to write one issue of Spawn.
true.
That's just
But
not happening.
I think Todd is the is as a business person has always pointed this thing in that way. And one of the other things, and I don't think we talked about it last episode, the early issues of Spawn all have like a pinup poster with which like yeah, if you want somebody to like love your character, like yeah, throw a poster in the middle of the book. Now they got something to hang up on their wall that other kids are gonna see and be like, "What's that? It looks cool as hell."
I have
And all the
so
posters are
many.
by like Frank Miller and like
Yeah.
great artists and George Perez and whatever. But in issue 5, so in the most intense issue of Spawn to date, there is a poster of the Spawn mobile
Hell yeah. The Spawn
with
Mobile.
with the page leading to it usually just says poster by Jim Lee or whatever. No, no, no. Todd McFarlane's Spawn Mobile #1 is a full page list of the specifications for the Spawn Mobile, a super competition eliminator funny car, and lists like what the body is, the chassis, the engine. So if you wanted to build your own, you could. It also lists the driver, the crew chief, and the crew. So I need to find out where they raced this thing. Also, its quarter mile performance, it did a quarter mile in 8.39 seconds at 167 miles an hour.
Wow. That
So,
I have no context for that. That's
in a
incredible.
way, Todd McFarlane is the Enzo Ferrari of comic
Wow, that's
books.
true. Wow. In a certain way. The Spawn Mobile. Yeah, I mean, I had so many magazines and comics that I had ruined by like cutting out or tearing out like pinups and
Yeah,
that kind of thing that I was just like, oh, I want that on my wall.
totally. I think this brings us to the end of these two issues.
Sure does.
Closing thoughts.
Closing thoughts. I think that this these two issues that kind of connect to each other are a very interesting mission statement for Spawn. They show more of what both Spawn's day to day kind of is in a lot of ways, and the characters and how they relate to each other more directly in issue number 5 than in the previous 4. And we see more of the cosmology and what Spawn's position ultimately is in all of this in number 8. Like you said, I think these almost speak more as a mission statement or as a real premiere than the first 4 issues do in some ways. But I also think they highlight a lot of what's tough about Spawn and about Tom McFarlane as a creator, and really about the 90s in general, and how a certain brand of 90s edginess holds up as really just edginess today.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. I think I might like these issues more than I did initially, and I liked 5 quite a bit when I first read it. I think I was a little lukewarm on 8, but in rereading it and kind of digging into really I think it's a very funny issue despite it being a little bit horrible. I like that we're sort of wrestling with the 2024ness of, we're looking at it with the 2024 lens, but I think we're being pretty measured toward like the thought process behind why some of these things that are like awkward in 2024, to say the least,
Right.
um, are kind of exist there. I think it would be interesting. We get sort of director's cuts of movies now, and I think sometimes it would be interesting, especially with the ability to redo digital lettering like fairly easily. I wonder how much with the art staying the same. I wonder what Todd now, 30 years later, would do with that first handful of issues that he had to write. When he was presumably a worse writer than he is now. I guess we'll get to his more his
We're going to find out, aren't we?
yeah, we are certainly going to. Anyway, this has been another episode of Spawnography. Thanks for listening. If you are on that cursed Elon Musk site, we're there at Spawnography Pod. You can find me at PE Lightning. You can email us at spawnography followuppod@gmail.com if you so please. Rate, review, subscribe on all the places where you might listen to our podcast. And George, where can people find you?
If you want to find me on social media, my handle pretty much at any site you can find me on is Crypt Trash. I don't really use Twitter or X very much anymore. I'm more on Blue Sky or sometimes Instagram. But you can also find my writing each and every day at newsarama.com.
Awesome. Next week, we will be diving into Spawn number 6 and 7. That is the Overt Kill arc, the introduction of Overt Kill. And then after that, we'll get into Neil Gaiman and Dave Sim and Frank Miller. So
Going to be
lots
quite
of
a
stuff to
ride.
look forward to. Yep. All right. Have a good one. Bye.